Today's review is going to be something special. Patron Shiny has recommended an old 1952 pulp science fiction novel, a real product of its times. It's also the creation of Isaac Asimov, one of my all-time favorite authors. And what's it called? David Starr, Space Ranger. About the author. Isaac Asimov is considered one of the greatest science fiction authors of all time, and I've been waiting to do a segment about him practically since I began doing them. Asimov was originally born in Western Russia in either 1919 or 1920. His family was Jewish, and with the Russian Civil War raging, it was kind of a bad time and place to be a Jew. So in 1923, the Asimov family moved to Brooklyn, and Isaac grew up speaking Yiddish and English. Asimov published his first science fiction short stories in 1939. And in 1940, he published a rather famous story called Robbie. Whereas most, if not all, robot stories of the time were about humans tampering in God's domain or the oppressed robot masses rising up against their creators, Robbie was a sweet little story about a girl, the robot nursemaid she loved, and her parents, caving into the anti-robot bigotry and separating the girl from her best friend. In the end, the two reunite, and the mother allows Robbie to come back home after it saves her daughter's life. Asimov wrote Robbie because he was sick of the more common types of robot stories, and as he reasoned, why would people make something that could turn against them so easily? We constantly work with dangerous things, but for every danger we create safeguards. Wires have insulation, ledges have railings, and even back in the 40s cars had fenders. Robbie was a hit, so Asimov continued his robot stories, and in 1941 he wrote a story which contained the 3 laws of robotics, which incidentally was the first time anyone had ever written the word robotics. Asimov would later coin the term psychohistory for his Foundation series, although he would later admit that he should have called it sociohistory, since it describes a field that predicts human history based on sociological trends. Asimov had a very utilitarian style, describing just enough about the locations, characters, and actions to explain the plot. The bulk of his books are conversations, and even with those, his characters tend to be plain and straightforward. As a result, Asimov wasn't an overnight success the way other authors from the golden age of science fiction were, and is also why his works don't get a lot of critical attention or movie adaptations. Still, there was no lack of trying. In 1951, Asimov's agent came to him with a proposal. Asimov would write a series of young adult science fiction novels with the goal of adapting them into a TV series. Asimov was not a fan of the TV sci-fi of the time, with good reason, honestly, so he responded with a condition. He would write the series under a pseudonym, Paul French, so that his name would not get attached to a terrible TV show. Turns out that didn't become a problem since the TV deal fell through, but Asimov would go on to write a total of 6 books for the series throughout the 1950s. He would only stop because, by the start of the 60s, Asimov decided to write nonfiction exclusively, and he didn't return to science fiction until the 70s. Isaac Asimov would continue writing science fiction and nonfiction right up until his death in 1992. He saw his end coming, mostly because he contracted HIV from a contaminated blood transfusion he got in 1983. If that's news to you, that's because there was a strong stigma against AIDS at the time of Asimov's death, and his widow didn't reveal the truth until 10 years later. But let's set aside Asimov's sad ending and head back to 1952 for the story. The book begins with an apology by Isaac Asimov. This is because I'm reading a reprint published in 1978, and as Asimov explains it, we've learned a lot about Mars in the quarter century between printings. Back in 1952, the idea of life on Mars was still almost plausible, as was the idea that the canals on Mars were actually there and not an optical illusion created by a low-power telescope. According to his apology, if he had written the book after probes had orbited and landed on Mars, the plot would have been very different. Anyway, the story itself begins in a restaurant on Earth. It's 5,000 years in the future, but for that, it's still a very 1950s future, where music bands need conductors, and where the average restaurant has private booths with curtains to screen out the rest of the world. This second fact comes in handy, because when David Starr is waiting for a friend, a fellow guest goes into a sudden fit and dies on the spot. The curtains let Starr conceal the incident from the rest of the patrons, and he orders the manager around because he is the youngest member of the Council of Science, an international organization with more power than most governments. Here's the lowdown. The restaurant patron died from eating a dessert made with Martian plums, even though his friend ordered the same dessert and he is perfectly fine. This has been happening at random all across the planet, but the death count is only in the double digits. The Council of Science has been keeping this quiet because Earth can't afford to panic and block Martian food imports. The planet has to import food because Earth farms can't sustain the massive population of 5 billion people. We then get some backstory on David Starr himself. 3 male scientists were friends back in the day, but all of them fell in love with the same woman. Starr's father was the one who married her, and they had David. But on a trip to Venus, their ship was attacked by pirates and destroyed. The pirates were wiped out by the Council, and in the process, they happened across an escape pod with a 4-year-old David inside. The other 2 scientists, Doctors Henry and Conway, adopted David and raised him themselves. And I'm sure Asimov's chronic inability to write women characters, aside from Susan Calvin in the robot stories, has nothing to do with this situation. As David Starr grows up, it becomes clear that he's becoming a perfect human specimen. Genius-level intellect, Adonis-like figure, the whole 9 yards. Henry and Conway can only speculate that David's early exposure to cosmic rays is somehow responsible to this. After all, it may be 5,000 years in the future, but science still doesn't understand much about how radiation affects the human body. Back in the present, David learns about the Martian food situation from his uncles, and so he heads to Mars under a pseudonym to investigate. He heads to an employment office first, and while he's there, he meets a prickly guy who calls himself Big Man, despite his height of 5 feet 2 inches. Starr acts like an Earth fugitive who desperately needs a job on the Martian farms despite having no experience, but then a fat boss-type guy named Hennis comes in and provokes Big Man, who tries to have his muscle Griswold throw him out, but then Starr intervenes. Starr then insinuates that he knows something about the food poisonings, so Hennis invites Starr and Big Man into his car and knocks them both out with a stun laser. When Starr comes to, he's locked up on a farm owned by Hennis's boss, Makian. Starr spins Makian a story about having a young sister who died from the food poisoning, and since the Council of Science suppressed the story, he decided to head to Mars and learn the truth himself. It sounds plausible, so Makian sends over Dr. Benson, an Earth-educated agricultural scientist who's been working on the food poisoning problem for months. He's had no luck cracking the case, even though he travels all across Mars to check random food samples. Still, it's obvious that the poisoning is some form of sabotage, because the Martian Farm Syndicate has received a demand to sell all of their land at far below market value, or things will get even worse. Makian and Benson agree to let Starr stick around since he might learn something they can't. But Hennis and Griswold still don't like him, and the other farm boys distrust the city slicker Earthman. By the way, farm boys basically means cowboys, except that there are no cows on Mars, so there you go. Starr gets stuck with kitchen duty for a while, but when he stands up to Griswold in the mess hall, he gets a chance to go on farm patrol, outside the pressurized and Earth gravity domes. Big Man sticks with him since he figures Griswold will want to get revenge, and it turns out he does, because he forgets to put weight rods on Starr's Mars buggy, and so it becomes basically uncontrollable. Starr almost falls down a Martian fissure. Big Man saves his life, and then Starr and Griswold have a fight right there on the edge of the cliff. Griswold loses and accidentally tumbles in, and after that, the farm boys have a new respect for Starr. Starr starts working for Benson directly, and when Big Man goes to find a job somewhere else, Starr asks him to run an errand for him. At this point, Big Man reveals that he knows who Starr really is. He recognized Starr from some news stories about him joining the council, and he only didn't say anything because he wasn't sure if he was right. Still, he happily agrees to help Starr since the two of them have become friends. It's at about this point that Starr hears Benson's theory that Martian life achieved sapience a billion years ago and retreated to underground caverns when the surface became inhospitable. Benson thinks that the Martians might somehow be responsible for what's going on, so Starr decides to investigate by getting some gear Big Man brings back and climbing down a fissure near where it meets a closed-off cavern. He finds a door, he passes through, he gets knocked out, and when he awakens, he discovers the truth. Martian intelligence has transcended the need for physical bodies, and when one of them manifests itself for Starr's benefit, it's a multicolored blob, like something from an original Star Trek episode. The Martians regard Starr with curiosity more than anything, and since they abandoned the surface, they don't care what the Earthlings decide to do with it. They also mention that what's left of Martian cellular life is poisonous to Earth creatures, which gives Starr an idea of who the real culprit could be. Finally, one of them calls Starr a space ranger, title drop, and they give him a personal force field that can deflect anything bigger than air molecules. The field also conceals his face and obscures his body, so this is officially a superhero origin story now. Starr returns to the farm during a Martian sandstorm, and he claims a being that called itself the Space Ranger saved him from certain death. However, Hennis accuses Starr of being a spy working for the poisoner, and he tries to kill him several times. Starr survives though, and he confronts Hennis in his room as the Space Ranger. But the reason he did so was to create a distraction. When Hennis blinds himself by firing a nuclear bullet into Starr's force field, Starr grabs a key, sneaks into the farm's lab, and gets the last bit of proof he needs. The next day, the Council of Science shows up with Big Man acting as a bodyguard, and Starr reveals that he is a COS agent. However, he also says that he and the Space Ranger are different people and have simply been working together. As the Ranger, Starr says that Hennis has been making trips to pirates in the asteroid belt, and they're the ones who issued the demands. However, the mastermind of the plot is on Mars, and his name is Benson. Benson had the opportunity thanks to testing food supplies all across the planet, and his sampling device was actually delivering the poison, a toxin based on the deadly Martian proteins. His motive was the total lack of respect everyone gave him, and the reason he took so long to escalate the situation was because he's squeamish about killing, unlike the pirates or Hennis. Starr then gets Hennis to talk by threatening him with the sampling device and gagging Benson so that he couldn't say that the sampler is empty. With the crisis resolved, Big Man asks Starr to take him along. After all, the two of them work well together, plus Big Man has already seen through the Space Ranger disguise. And so, now that the perfect human specimen has a disguise with superpowers and a sidekick, this superhero origin story comes to an end. The analysis. This has to be the pulpiest pulp science fiction story I ever did read. It's got all the hallmarks. The ubermensch blonde-haired male protagonist with a plucky and slightly deformed sidekick, the blending of science fiction, cowboys, and superheroes in a mystery story, and of course the marginal roles or complete absence of women. It's as if Isaac Asimov sat down in front of a TV, watched a few genre programs, and said to himself, "Oh, so this is what the kids are into these days." And he proceeded to write a story that included everything he saw. I'm not even exaggerating here, I'm pretty sure that's exactly what he did. And yet, at the same time, the book is also very much in Asimov's style. I'd say he made an effort to add more action and descriptions than he usually does, but ultimately the book is still mostly civil conversations between various male characters. Now, I mean, the whole Asimov doesn't write female characters thing isn't completely true. His books do have female characters, and for the most part they aren't stereotypes, but I don't think this book has a single woman in it. Well, I guess there's Starr's mother, but she died before the story began, so I don't think that counts. Still, you shouldn't take what I'm saying to be reasons not to read the book. David Starr's Space Ranger is a fun read, and it's a light novel, so you'll finish it before you know it. And I've said already that I love reading Asimov, right? I've got half a shelf full of his books, and many of them originally belonged to my dad. Asimov may not be good with the artistic side of writing, but he makes up for it with interesting plots about the possible problems and solutions we as humanity might face in the future. What if we build robots, and the problems aren't with them becoming sentient and murderous, but with shoddy programming? What if machine intelligences subtly take over the world and end up making it a better place for humans to live? What if we learn how to tap energy from alternate universes, but people refuse to give that energy up even though using it will lead to a global catastrophe? Asimov wrote The Gods Themselves in 1972, back when people were just beginning to worry about global warming. He also wrote a story called Nightfall, which is about a planet with so many suns that true nightfall only happens once every 2,000 years. When it happens, the inhabitants don't go insane from seeing the darkness. They go insane because, for once, they see the stars and they realize how terrifyingly huge the universe really is. And that's what I'm talking about. Asimov didn't write pretty, but his plots are pretty interesting. But to get back to the book at hand, the Lucky Star series is sadly hard to find outside of used bookstores. They aren't exactly Asimov's most classic works, so they haven't been reprinted in years. Still, if you happen to find the name Lucky Star and either Paul French or Isaac Asimov on the byline, I'd say it's worth picking up. Thanks for joining me again for today's book review, and I hope I'll see you next time for a modern story based on Russian mythology.